Hello and welcome, fellow travelers. I'm your host, Chris Abernathy, and today we're going to be talking about authenticity and what it means for us as Christians. And I want to invite you on this journey with me, one of hope, encouragement, and discovery, seeking the way. So why exactly are we talking about authenticity? And what is it really? What relevance does it have for Christians? These are the topics we're going to be exploring today. Now, I have to say that this is part one of a three-part series, and this is just kind of laying the foundation for the next 2 weeks. This all builds off of each other. So if this seems incomplete, just wait for the next couple weeks. I promise it all comes back around. So some of you may have seen my post on social media the other day with the Bible verse 1 Peter 3:15. And it says to make a defense for the hope that is in your heart. Now this word defense is the Greek word apologia, and it has to do with lawyers presenting their case. And whenever a lawyer presents their case, they have to present their evidence, right? Their case has to be proved beyond the shadow of a doubt. So that's what I'm seeking to do. So throughout the course of this podcast, you will hear me bringing in outside information, theories from philosophers, objective evidence studies, and all that. And it is all with the intent of making a defense for the hope that is in my heart. And I hope that it will help you do the same thing. Now, I mentioned that because today, in our discussion about authenticity, we are going to be talking about 3 different theories from philosophers on authenticity. My wife gets really bored with philosophers. I hope that's not the case for you. I hope that you all will enjoy this discussion. But on the off chance that you are like my wife and you may get a little bored with the philosophers, just hang with me. I promise I'll bring it back around, and I'll try not to spend too much time on them. So why is authenticity so important? And it really comes down to how we live our lives. Now, in case you didn't know, we only have one life to live. And you've probably heard a lot of people saying that they're going to do all these things to become the best version of themselves, whether it's reading a book, trying to improve a skill, go to the gym, eat healthy. And I would encourage everyone to do all of these things. But my question became, when we're seeking to become the best version of ourselves, how do we know that that's actually the best version of ourselves? It's not like we can look in the mirror and see ourselves and know for sure, yes, I have arrived. This is the best that I could possibly be. I don't think that we can actually choose that. Rather, I think that every day we're just in a process of becoming better than we were the day prior. And the reason why I say that is because I know that for me, who I am today is extremely different than the person that I was 2 years ago. And that person is extremely different than the person I was 10 years ago. And that person was extremely different than the person that I was 20 years ago. And the same goes for the future. Who I am today is extremely different than who I'm going to be 2 years, 10 years, 20 years down the road. So even if I think that I am currently the best version of myself right now, that is not going to be the best version of who I'm going to be 10 years down the road. And so this idea of becoming the quote-unquote best version, it implies kind of like arriving at the end. We have achieved the pinnacle. But we will never be able to do that in this lifetime. You will never be able to become the literal best version of yourself because there's always more to improve on. And so striving for the best version of yourself almost is like, it's like a wild goose chase. Rather, we should strive to be better than we were the day before. And to become a better version of ourselves, we have to be the most authentic version of ourselves. And just like becoming the best version, I don't think that we can choose the most authentic version of ourselves. Now, being the most authentic version of yourself is tied a lot in your identity. Now, we have some core-based decisions that kind of make up our identity, but once again, identity, who we are, I believe is a discovery process. And the reason why I say that is because if you look back throughout your life, I know that there are people that you've met that have impacted you so profoundly, have maybe even been life-changing, that you never planned to meet. And the same goes with events that happen in our lives, especially adversity. Nobody plans for adversity in their lives because Nobody would want to go through that. But when we go through that adversity, those are some of the biggest growth moments that we could ever possibly have. And so if we don't plan these things, if these things are outside of our control, these relationships, these people, these events, then we can't choose what the most authentic version of ourselves looks like. Rather, it comes about as a result of these relationships and how we react to these events. So what is authenticity? Well, when I was thinking about this and reading on these various theories that were proposed, I initially thought it was a relationship between two entities, us and society. But as I thought about it, as I prayed about it some more, I realized that it's actually a relationship between three entities: us, society, and God. And I came to realize that authenticity cannot be found in a vacuum. If we cannot control the people that we're going to meet, then we can't just find our authenticity just like holed up somewhere. Part of the information that informs that thought for me is that when you're talking to people who are on their deathbed, their best and worst memories always surround people. It's not that they wish they made more money. It's not that they wish they'd traveled more. When all of the materialism and the achievement is stripped away, the only thing that remains is the people that they loved and the relationships they had. It doesn't matter if those relationships ended up bad or good. Maybe it's a parent who had a poor relationship with their child as the child got older. There's a regret there. There's a wish to reconcile that relationship. And this is why I say authenticity, our authenticity, cannot be found in a vacuum. If the most important things that we're going to remember before we pass is surrounding people, then we can only find our most authentic selves with people. Now, this whole relationship of authenticity, especially surrounding people, is a bit nuanced. And this is where the various theories come in. So there's three philosophers that I want to talk about, because I think that each of them contributes something to this idea that I came across. And it's in their similarities that kind of like forms this foundation. So there was this movement in philosophy known as existentialism. And existentialism was focused around the individual making the choice of who they are to be. So the first philosopher was Soren Kierkegaard, and this man was a Danish philosopher, and he was a Christian. And he was actually tired of the way that the church was brainwashing people to be. So this theory that he develops is focused around personal choice and faith, and out of this he develops three spheres of existence. Now, these spheres are like actual realities that people can exist in based upon their actions, but they're also mindsets. And the first one is the aesthetic sphere. And this is the sphere where you just do whatever you want to. Whatever makes you feel good, you go out and drink, you take whatever you want, whatever makes you feel good, whatever kind of feeds those base desires that you're feeling right now, that's the first one. The second one is the moral sphere. And this is where you start to consider the morality of actions. Maybe you don't steal that thing from that individual because you're considering how it would impact them and how it could potentially impact you. And then the last sphere is the religious sphere. Kierkegaard believed that this was the most important one. This is where you truly found your authenticity, because this is where you found God. And in God, you find your identity. And this is one thing that I do 100% agree with him on. The thing about these spheres, though, is that you didn't like check off things on a checklist to graduate from one sphere to the next. It was a personal choice. Once in the aesthetic, you had to make the choice to move beyond those base desires and consider the morality of your actions. And then beyond that, you had to make the choice to submit to God to move on to the religious sphere. And in that religious sphere, just as easily as you made that personal choice to move up, you could fall back based upon your actions. If you weren't doing what Christ calls us to do, which is to die daily to ourselves, if you weren't making that personal choice to remain in relationship with God, you could fall back to the moral sphere. So it was something that you constantly had to work at and be aware of. The next philosopher that I found interesting, who you may have heard of, was Friedrich Nietzsche. Now, Nietzsche is the one who coined the term God is dead. And a lot of people today use that statement almost as like an anthem of victory. God is dead. But that's not how Nietzsche used it. Rather, he used that term in a sense of resignation. You see, Nietzsche believed that without God, our purpose became less clear. And therefore, it was on us as the individual to determine our own purpose. But that also put the responsibility of that on us. Nietzsche also had this idea of an overman or Übermensch. It's the individual who, despite whatever circumstances that they're going through, they will stand up, recognize who they are, remain true to who they are, and rise above their circumstances. Now, unfortunately, the Nazi Party would adopt this idea for their desires and their own purposes, but what the Nazi Party did is not what Nietzsche intended. You see, Nietzsche's Overman, it was almost like a form of stoicism, to remain resolute no matter what your circumstances. The last philosopher that I found interesting was a French philosopher named Jean-Paul Sartre. Now, I want to be upfront with the fact that I disagree very much so with a lot of what Jean-Paul Sartre said and also did. But I also believe that if we just dismiss opposing ideas and theories just because we don't like the individual, then we're not necessarily being intellectually honest. Now, that doesn't mean that if I find a theory intellectually honest and it goes against the Bible, I will attend to that theory. I'll give that theory precedence over what the Bible says. That is not true at all. However, Sartre came up with this theory known as bad faith. And Sartre was a realist. He believed in recognizing who you were for exactly who you are. So that is to say that if you are a terrible person, and I say that like subjectively, maybe if you're a bad person who just does bad things all the time, to do anything other than those bad things was to be acting in bad faith to who you are. He was a realist. He believed in recognizing all your strengths, all your flaws, and being who you are in that like raw, real image. Now, these three men all believed that you had to find yourself outside of society. And what I mean by that is that the modern view that society puts forward, to buy into that is to lose yourself as the individual. Basically, you become part of groupthink. You become a sheep to society. You lose who you are because you're buying into what society is saying. And I do believe that there is an element of truth to that, especially with the advent of social media. People are putting out these images, these unrealistic images that everybody else wants to attain to. Oh, look, this person looks amazing. They get to go on trips all the time. They make so much money. This is what I want to do. But the problem with that is it's so focused on themselves. And I disagree with that. So from these three men, I got this theory of authenticity, a relationship between three entities: us, society, and God. Now, while I do agree that we cannot find our identity in society, I do think it's through relationships, as I previously mentioned, that we find our authenticity. And from Jean-Paul Sartre, once we kind of start to get an idea of who we are, if we act in any way that's counter to that, then we're acting in bad faith to who we are. Now, I opened up this podcast episode with talking about apologetics because this information, this data, is what I'm bringing in to make a defense for the hope that is in my heart. This information helped me come up with this idea that reinforces exactly what the Bible teaches. And I thought that that was relevant, that was important. There should be information, if what the Bible teaches is true, and I wholeheartedly believe it is, there should be information out there that backs up what the Bible teaches. So what does Jesus say about Christians? Well, he says that we're to be in the world, but not of the world. So if we take this idea of being in society, we're in the world, but we do not lose our identity to the world. And if we're in the world, we're going to be making relationships with people, and through those relationships and following God's path for us, we will find the most authentic, true version of ourselves. I came across this quote in my program that I'm going through that really drove this point home. And it says, when biblical theology conflicts with strongly held cultural views, the tendency is to modify or conform the theology to the culture. This is, of course, backward. But it is also precisely what the culture in Jerusalem did to Jeremiah, and it resulted in the exile. You see, we as Christians, I think, at least in the Western world, have a tendency to view these cultural issues that we're experiencing, and rather than turning to the Bible, we try and make the Bible fit the cultural view. And if we're doing that, we're basically just making up a religion that we want to feel good about. We're not submitting ourselves to what the Bible calls us to. The philosopher Plato once said that the unexamined life is not worth living, and I 100% agree with him, because the only way that we can take stock of what we're doing is to examine our lives. So if you want a really good example of the encroachment of modern society on God's people, all we have to do is turn to 2 Kings 22, which is the story of Josiah. Now, Josiah is the grandson of the worst king in the history of Israel, named Manasseh. Josiah takes over at the age of 8. As he gets older, he turns to his secretary and says, "Go tell the priest to gather offerings so that work on the temple can continue." The secretary goes and tells the priest. The priest is looking around for these offerings, and he finds this book that he doesn't even know what it is. As he starts to read it, he realizes this is the law of Moses. This is the Mosaic law that the Israelite people have been reading and following throughout most of the Old Testament. Do you realize what happened here? They lost the law of Moses. You see, the encroachment of pagan culture was so severe that Manasseh, Josiah's grandfather, actually sacrificed his own sons to the Canaanite gods. And this is only 290-ish years after King Solomon, supposedly the wisest king. So King Josiah tells the priest to go inquire to God as to what this is. Brothers and sisters, can you imagine if that happened today? That the encroachment of society was so severe that we put our Bibles aside and just forgot about them. 300 years later, somebody just picks one up. Look, we have to examine our lives in order to ensure that we're leading a biblical life. We need to be part of society and yet at the same time separate from it. If we're not examining our lives, we're probably missing the mark. If we're not willing to change our lives, attitudes, behaviors, and hearts to be in line with what Jesus calls us to do, then I would venture to say that we have not fully submitted our lives to Christ. Throughout the course of the Bible, we see that it is inherently anti-cultural. The things that Jesus teaches have always been counterintuitive to society. But the good news is that it's not too late to start. I'm talking about every single Christian. I'm not trying to I'm calling everybody out and up, not just an individual, not just a group of people. As Christians in general, we need to strive better to live our lives the way that Jesus calls us to. And if we do that, if we strive to be set apart like we're called to, we'll be starting down the path of authenticity, which will lead us to be who God wants us to be. Thank you so much for joining me today for the first episode in this series on authenticity. Next week, we'll talk about the two most dominant ways our society views success and how they really ultimately lead us to lose who we are. Thank you, fellow travelers, and I look forward to continuing this journey with you next week. God bless.